He laughed at funerals. A Miss Marple mystery. There is something about a village at dusk. The last post has been collected. The vicar's wife has drawn the curtains. Somewhere, a kettle is coming to the boil. And yet, underneath all of that ordinary warmth, something is not quite right. You can feel it, the way you feel a draft from a door that was never left open. Tonight's story takes place in just such a village. A visitor arrived, a visitor left, and sometime between those two facts, a person was found dead. Someone knows more than they are saying. Someone noticed something they do not yet understand they noticed, and one old lady, in a garden chair, is already putting it together. Before we begin, I would like to know who is settling in with me tonight. Are you at home, with a cup of something warm? On a late shift, taking a quiet moment for yourself? Perhaps retired, with the evening ahead of you and nothing to hurry for, or simply someone who cannot resist a mystery. Hands busy with something else, half listening, half thinking. Tell me below. I read everyone. Now, something is waiting to be found. Chapter 1. Arrivals. The drive at Ashworth Hall was never meant for so many cars at once, and by 11:30 on Friday morning it had run out of room. Albert, who had opened that door to funerals before, stood at the top of the steps with his hands folded and watched a fourth motor turn in at the gate and stop short behind the others, uncertain where to go. It was Gerald Pembridge's car, and Gerald got out of it the way he did most things now, a little too fast, a little too loud, as though speed might cover the smell of whiskey on his breath at 11:30 in the morning. His wife Faith came round from the other side, with a black hat in her gloved hands, not yet put on, and a face that suggested she had spent the drive down asking him to slow down and had given it up somewhere around Maidstone. "Well, here we are," Gerald said to nobody in particular, and went up the steps two at a time. Inside, the hall was full of the particular hush of a house getting ready to bury someone. Black crape had gone up over the looking-glasses in the manner Edith Pembridge still held to, though her mother had taught it to her, and nobody under 60 did it any more. The clocks had been stopped at the hour of Walter's death 9 days before, which Connie had insisted on, and which Mrs. Tolley privately thought a great nuisance, since nobody could ever say what time it actually was in that house now. Constance Pembridge came down the stairs as her brother came in, and the two of them met in the hall in the way of people who had grown up sharing a nursery and had little tenderness left over for adult life. "You might have come yesterday," Connie said. "Mother wanted help with the flowers. I had things to settle in town." "You always have things to settle in town?" Gerald did not answer that. He went past her into the morning room, where a fire had been lit, though the day was not yet cold, only grey, with a sky that hung low over the bare elms in the park, and threatened something nobody had yet given a name to. It was into this morning room, 20 minutes later, that Miss Jane Marple was shown by Albert, who had not been told quite who she was, and had decided, from her hat and her knitting bag, that she must be a poor relation on the wife's side. "Miss Marple, madam," he said to Edith, who rose from her chair with real warmth for the first time that morning. "Jane, how good of you to come all this way." "My dear Edith, I would not have missed it." Miss Marple took the offered hand in both of hers. "Though I confess, I very nearly did. The train from Paddington was 40 minutes late, and a man in my compartment talked the entire way about silage, which I know nothing about, and am now obliged to know a great deal more than I wish to." It was the kind of remark that made Edith smile despite herself, which was, though neither of them said so, exactly why Edith had written to ask her old school friend to come. They had been at Miss Lavender's together 40 years before, and had not seen each other above a dozen times since. But a letter from St. Mary Mead in time of trouble had seemed to Edith the most natural thing in the world to write. "You'll forgive the house," Edith said. "We're all at 6s and 7s. Connie has been wonderful, of course, but it has fallen rather heavily on her." "It always does fall on the daughter," said Miss Marple, "however many sons there are standing about being no use." Edith's sister Lavinia came down soon after, a thin, anxious woman, some years younger than Edith, who had lived at the Hall since her own husband's death, and occupied, in that household, the uncertain position of a permanent guest who is also family and is never quite sure which rule applies on any given day. She kissed Miss Marple's cheek with real feeling, said something indistinct about how dreadful it all was, and went off again almost at once to see about the black gloves, which had not, it seemed, arrived from the shop in time, and were causing her a disproportionate amount of distress. Dr. Webley came up from the village just before noon, on foot, since the lane was still clear enough then for walking, though not much else, and let himself in by the side door, in the manner of a man who had been doing so for 30 years and saw no reason to start ringing bells now. He went straight to Edith, took both her hands in his, and said nothing at all for a moment, which struck Miss Marple, watching from the stairs, as a more honest piece of comfort than anything that had been said to Edith all morning. She was given a room on the second floor, over the garden, with a fire laid but not yet lit, and a window from which she could see the kitchen yard and a good part of the drive. She noted this without particularly meaning to, in the way she noted most things, and unpacked her black dress for the afternoon and a grey one for the days after, and sat by the window for a while with her hands folded, watching the cars come in. The last to arrive, just before 1, was a low green car, driven too fast for the gravel, which sent a spray of small stones against the front step and brought Albert to the door, with an expression he did not trouble to hide. The young man who got out of it was tall, dark, and entirely at his ease, which was, Miss Marple thought, watching from above, an odd thing to be on the day of one's uncle's funeral. "Hello, Albert," he called up the steps. "Still here, I see. I'd have thought you'd have retired by now and let some younger fool deal with the lot of us." "Mr. Rupert," said Albert, in the voice of a man declining to be drawn. Rupert Hale came up the steps 2 at a time, in a black overcoat that had been cut for him in a better year, and paused at the top to look back at the house and the bare park beyond it, with the particular pleasure of a man returning somewhere he has every right to be and no great affection for. "He laughs too easily, that one," said Mrs. Tolly later, bringing up the tea, for a house in mourning. Miss Marple, who had thought exactly the same thing watching from the window, said only that young men nowadays did not always know how to behave, and let the housekeeper draw her own conclusions, which were, as it turned out, very near the truth. Chapter 2. The Funeral. The church at Lower Medlow held the Pembridges, and had held them for 200 years, in a side chapel with their name cut into the stone in letters worn soft by generations of polish, and it was there that Walter Pembridge was carried at 2 o'clock on a Friday that had by then made up its mind to snow. The first flakes came down while the vicar was still speaking, fine and dry, settling on black shoulders, and not melting, which country people took to mean a hard fall coming. Miss Marple, standing near the back beside Edith's unmarried sister Lavinia, who lived at the Hall and had wept steadily and quietly since the church door, watched the family rather than the coffin, which she had found over many years to be the more instructive object at any funeral. Edith stood very straight, her face composed into the particular blankness of a woman who has cried already, alone, where no one could see her, and intends to get through the rest of it without obliging anyone to comfort her. Gerald stood with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the middle distance, the picture of a son in mourning, though Miss Marple had already heard, from Mrs. Tolly by way of the morning tea tray, a good deal about what Gerald owed to bookmakers in 3 counties. Faith had her prayer book open and her lips moving along with the vicar's, sincerely, which was more than could be said for most of the party. Connie stood closest to the grave, in the place a daughter takes, and did not cry at all. Her face had the fixed, held look of someone managing something by main force, and once, when the vicar spoke of a long and faithful life, her mouth tightened in a way that might have been grief, and might, Miss Marple thought, have been something nearer to anger. It was Rupert who laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It came at the very end, as the coffin went down and the vicar said the last words over it, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds, no more, a short sound, bitten off almost as soon as it began, as though something private and entirely unconnected with the burial had crossed his mind and got the better of him before he could stop it. Dr. Webley, standing beside him, turned his head sharply. Faith's eyes went wide. Connie did not turn at all, but Miss Marple, watching her rather than Rupert, saw her shoulders go rigid for exactly as long as the laugh lasted, and no longer. Afterward, walking back across the churchyard in a snow that was coming down properly now, large flakes that caught in black hatbands and did not melt, Miss Marple found herself beside Dr. Webley, a broad, grey, kindly-looking man whom she had been told was Walter's oldest friend as well as his physician. "A sad business," she said, by way of opening. "Very sad." He glanced back toward Rupert, who was some way behind them, lighting a cigarette with his coat collar turned up against the snow, entirely unconcerned. "Young Hale takes it lightly, I'm afraid. He was always a careless boy. His mother was the same, God rest her." "It is a strange thing to laugh at," Miss Marple said mildly. "A graveside." "It is," Dr. Webley said, and said no more. But she noticed that he did not offer her any of the easy explanations a kinder or less thoughtful man might have reached for, about nerves, or grief taking strange forms, or a private joke remembered at the wrong moment. He simply did not offer an explanation at all, which Miss Marple, who paid close attention to what people declined to say, thought was its own sort of answer. By the time the cars came back up the long drive to Ashworth Hall, the snow had thickened into something with real intention behind it, and Albert, taking coats at the door, remarked to Mrs. Tolley in the kitchen passage that they would be lucky to see the lane clear by Monday. "All the better," said Mrs. Tolley, who had 30 years in that house, and very little patience left for any of the people presently filling it. "Let them all sit and look at each other a while. Might do some good." She did not, at the time, mean it as a prophecy. But it was, as things turned out, very nearly exact. Chapter 3. Friday Dinner. Dinner was at 8, which Edith had insisted upon keeping to its normal hour, on the theory that a house which abandoned its habits on the day of a funeral would never get them back. Mrs. Tolley had done a goose, there being nothing else large enough in the larder for 9 people, and Albert had brought up 2 bottles of the 38 claret that Walter had laid down himself, and would, Connie observed rather pointedly, have hated to see opened for anyone but a special occasion. "I should think a funeral counts," Rupert said, holding out his glass for more. "It was Father's funeral," Connie said, "not yours. All the more reason to drink his good wine instead of leaving it to whoever inherits the cellar." Rupert smiled at her over the rim of his glass, perfectly pleasant, perfectly maddening. "Unless you mean to keep it under lock and key along with everything else, Connie." There was a small, ugly silence, the kind that happens at a dinner table when everyone present understands a thing has been said that should not have been said in front of the guests, and nobody quite knows how to cover it. Edith filled it, after a moment, by asking Miss Marple some question about St. Mary Mead that did not require an interesting answer, and the table moved on. But Miss Marple, eating her goose with every appearance of placid attention to her hostess, noted that Rupert had not looked away from Connie while he said it, and that Connie had not looked at him at all. Lavinia, who had said almost nothing through the meal, ventured at this point that she thought it most unkind to speak of Walter's wine or Walter's opinions at all on the very day of his funeral, and that in her late husband's family such talk would not have been permitted at the table under any circumstances whatever. Nobody answered her directly, which was, Miss Marple gathered from a lifetime spent observing families very like this one, more or less what Lavinia had learned to expect whenever she ventured an opinion in that house. It was Faith who tried, later, over the savoury, to smooth things further, in the manner of a woman who believes harmony can be restored by main force of goodwill. "It is so hard for everyone," she said, to the table generally. Uncle Walter was such a presence in this house. One feels it everywhere. One does, said Rupert, though I must say I keep expecting him to walk in and complain about the wine after all. He always did have opinions about wine he hadn't been asked for. Rupert, said Gerald, in the voice of an elder cousin trying to assert an authority he did not really have. What? I'm allowed to remember the man fondly, surely. He was very fond of me, you know. This last year, we had some most interesting talks, the two of us, up in the study after everyone else had gone to bed. He said this lightly, looking round the table as he said it, and let his eyes rest, just for a moment, on Connie. He told me a good many things. Did he? Connie said. Her voice was perfectly level. Miss Marple, 2 places down, thought it was the kind of levelness that cost something to keep. He did. I dare say we'll all find out what in time. Rupert raised his glass, smiling at nothing in particular, and drank. Dr. Webley, who had said almost nothing through the whole exchange, set down his own glass with rather more care than the action required. I think, he said, that we have all had a long day, and a long one tomorrow if this snow keeps up. Perhaps we might leave the dead in peace tonight. It was the kind of remark that ends a subject at an English dinner table without anyone having to admit the subject needed ending, and the talk did move on, to the weather, to the state of the lane, to whether the Sunday post would get through at all if the drifts came up against the gate, as they had in 47. But Miss Marple, knitting by the drawing-room fire an hour later, while the men smoked, and the women made the kind of conversation that fills time rather than uses it, found herself turning over one small detail that had nothing to do with wine or laughing at gravesides. Earlier that afternoon, before the funeral party returned, she had come down the back stairs by mistake, looking for the linen cupboard she had been told was on her landing and was not, and had passed the door of what she took to be a still room or pantry, standing open. Connie had been inside, at a shelf of small brown bottles, sorting them with the quick, competent hands of someone who has done a thing many times before, murmuring to Mrs. Tolley that the doctor's stock should go back to the village dispensary, now there was no more need of it in the house, no sense letting good medicine go to waste, sitting in a dead man's cupboard. It was, on its face, the most natural thing in the world. A daughter, clearing away her father's medicines. Miss Marple had thought nothing more of it at the time than that it showed a sensible, practical turn of mind in a house otherwise given over to grief and crepe. She thought rather more of it now, sitting by the fire with her needles clicking, listening to Rupert Hale's easy, carrying laugh from across the room, and to the snow ticking against the long windows like something patient that meant to be let in eventually, whatever anyone did to keep it out. Chapter 4. The snow closes in. By 11, the telephone had already begun to behave badly, the line crackling and dropping away mid-sentence when Gerald tried to ring his club to say he would not be back as planned on Saturday. And by midnight, when Albert went round locking up, it had gone altogether silent, a dead, useless thing in the hall that nobody troubled to mention to the family until morning. The lane fared no better. Albert reported to Edith, last thing, that the drifts at the gate stood a good 3 feet and rising, and that the bridge over the Medlow stream, never a sound piece of work even in summer, had a crust of ice on it that no sensible man would trust a car to. They were, in the plain country way of putting it, snowed in, and likely to remain so until somebody came out from the village with a horse and a great deal of patience. "How thoroughly inconvenient," said Edith, more to herself than to Albert, and went up to bed with the particular tiredness of a woman who has buried a husband and fed 9 people and now finds the roof itself conspiring to keep them all under it together a while longer. The house settled slowly. Lights went out one by one along the upper corridor. Gerald and Faith's door closed with the soft, final click of 2 people who have nothing further to say to each other that night. Dr. Webley's lamp burned a little longer than the rest, a thin line under his door that Daisy, going along with the last of the hot water cans, noticed and thought nothing of, doctors being given to reading late, in her experience. Rupert's room was at the end of the passage, over the old nursery, and his light was on later than anyone's. Daisy, knocking with his can, found him still half-dressed, his collar off, sitting at the little writing desk with a sheet of paper in front of him that he covered with his forearm when she came in the unhurried way of a man who is not really troubled by being seen, only mildly inconvenienced. "Thank you, Daisy. Leave it by the washstand. Will there be anything else, sir?" "No." "Yes. Tell whoever brings the morning tray I'll have my whiskey and hot water sent up tonight instead. There's a good girl, rather than waiting for the early call. Saves a trip." He smiled at her, the easy smile that made the older servants distrust him and the younger ones rather like him despite themselves. "I find I sleep better with it inside me than waiting for it." Daisy carried the message down to the kitchen passage, where Mrs. Tolly, putting the last of the supper things away, made up the toddy herself, rather than leave it to the kitchen maid, who was new and careless with measures, and sent Albert up with it on a small tray a little before midnight, the whiskey, the hot water jug, the sugar, set out as it had always been set out in that house, for gentlemen who wanted a nightcap and did not want to be troubled to ring twice for it. Whether anything happened to that tray between the kitchen passage and Rupert Hale's door was a question nobody thought to ask that night, because nobody yet knew there was any reason to ask it. The house went dark. The snow went on falling, steady and silent, filling in the tracks of the day's cars until the drive looked, by 2 in the morning, as though no one had come or gone from Ashworth Hall in 100 years. Chapter 5. Saturday morning Daisy went up with the morning trays at 7:30, as she always did, working her way along the corridor, by the order Mrs. Tolly had taught her, the doctor first, then the family. Mr. Hale's room last, because he never liked being woken early, and there was no profit in starting an argument before breakfast. She knocked twice, got no answer, and let herself in, as she had been told to do when a guest did not stir, to draw the curtains and leave the tray regardless. The curtains had not been drawn the night before, and the grey morning light came straight across the bed and across Rupert Hale's face, which was turned a little toward the window, his eyes not quite shut, his arm hanging down off the edge of the mattress, with his fingers curled loosely against the carpet. The glass that had held his nightcap stood on the table by the bed, empty, but for a film of something pale gone dry at the bottom of it. Daisy did not scream, which she was rather proud of afterward. Though her hands shook so badly, she put the tray down on the washstand before she trusted herself to carry it another step. She went instead, very fast, down the back stairs to Mrs. Tolly, and got out, perhaps 4 words, before the housekeeper had her coat off the peg, and was halfway up the front stairs herself, calling for the doctor as she went. Dr. Webley was dressed and shaved already, an old habit of early rising that had served him well in 40 years of country practice, and he was in the room within 2 minutes, Mrs. Tolly just behind him, Edith roused by the noise and standing white-faced in her dressing gown in the doorway, with Connie's hand on her arm. It did not take him long to be certain. He had seen death often enough to know it at a glance, and there was, besides, no warmth left anywhere in the body by the time he laid his hand against it. "He's gone," he said, straightening up. "Some hours, I should think. Perhaps 4, perhaps more." He looked at the glass on the table for a long moment without touching it, and something crossed his broad, kindly face that was not quite the professional blankness he had worn a moment before. "His heart," Edith said, from the doorway, in the flat, disbelieving voice of a woman for whom one death, in a house inside a fortnight, has already used up her capacity for shock and left nothing over for a second. Like Walter. Oh, Simon, not another. "I don't know yet what it was," Dr. Webley said, more sharply than he perhaps intended, and Connie, standing very still beside her mother, said nothing at all, though Miss Marple, arriving in the doorway a moment later, with her dressing gown buttoned to the throat and her hair in its night plait, thought that of everyone gathered in that cold little knot in the corridor, Connie Pembridge was the only one whose face showed no surprise whatsoever, only a kind of held, careful blankness, the same blankness she had worn at her father's grave the day before. He was a young man, Dr. Webley said, half to himself, looking back at the bed. A healthy young man. He did not finish the thought, but he did not need to. Nobody in that corridor needed telling that healthy young men in their middle 30s do not, as a rule, simply die in their sleep, 2 nights running in the same house, however hard the family had lately been praying that this particular fortnight might please be over. The telephone, Gerald said, from further down the passage, where he had come to see what the commotion was, and stood now in his shirt sleeves, looking rather grey himself. We ought to ring the police. The telephone is dead, said Albert, who had tried it twice already that morning out of habit before anyone asked him to. And the lane is worse than last night, sir. Nobody is getting in or out of this house today, police or otherwise. There was a silence in the corridor then that had nothing comfortable in it at all. 9 living people and a snowbound house, and, behind a closed door at the end of the passage, the body of a man who only the evening before had sat at their table and laughed about wine he had no right to be drinking, and a study, he had said, where he and his late uncle had talked a great deal, the last few months, about things he dare say they would all find out about in time. Miss Marple, going quietly back to dress, found herself thinking that Rupert Hale had, after all, been quite right about that, though not, she suspected, in the way he had meant it. Chapter 6. Questions. In the morning room. There being no police to be had until the lane cleared, and Dr. Webley flatly refusing to allow the body to be moved or the room disturbed until somebody in authority had seen it, the household settled, with the particular grim practicality of the English upper middle class in a crisis, into a kind of private inquiry of its own, conducted over a breakfast nobody much wanted, and continued, in pieces, through the long grey morning that followed. It must have been his heart, Faith said, for perhaps the 4th time, buttering toast she did not eat. These things run in families sometimes, don't they, Simon? Uncle Walter's heart, and now poor Rupert's. Rupert's heart, said Dr. Webley, was the soundest thing about him. I examined him myself not 8 months ago, for an insurance matter. There was nothing wrong with that young man's heart. This was not, on the whole, the comfort Faith had been hoping for, and the table fell quiet again. It was Gerald who broke it, rather too quickly, in the manner of a man anxious to get a thing said before it can be said about him instead. Well, somebody had better say it. He'd had a great deal to drink last night. We all saw that. A man can do himself a deal of damage mixing whiskey with whatever else, can't he? Even a healthy one. Whatever else, Gerald? Connie's voice was very quiet. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm only saying. You're only saying, Connie repeated, and something in the flatness of it made Gerald put down his toast and not pick it up again. Miss Marple, pouring her own tea with the unhurried attention of a woman entirely absorbed in getting the milk in first, noted that Gerald's hand on the toast had not been entirely steady, and noted also that he had been the last of the family, besides Faith, to come up to bed the night before, a fact volunteered by Albert in the kitchen passage that morning, along with a great many other small facts that a butler accumulates and is generally too discreet to mention to anyone but another servant. I understand, she said, into the silence, in the mild voice of an old lady making conversation rather than an investigator asking questions, that Mr. Hale and your father had grown very close this last year. He mentioned it himself at dinner. They had, Edith said, before either of her children could answer. Walter took to him remarkably, toward the end. I confess I was a little surprised. They were not close, before. Rupert hardly came near the place for years, and then suddenly, this past spring, he was here every other week, shut up with Walter in the study for hours at a time. Talking about what, I wonder, said Miss Marple. Family matters, I imagine, Edith said, with the particular vagueness of a woman who has decided not to know the answer to her own question. Walter never discussed his business with me. But Gerald's eyes had gone, just for a moment, to the door of the study, visible from where they sat, closed now and locked since Tuesday, when the solicitor had been down to begin sorting Walter's papers ahead of Monday's reading of the will, and Connie's hand, Miss Marple noticed, had gone quite still around her teacup, and stayed still rather longer than the conversation seemed to require. Daisy, questioned by nobody in particular but volunteering it to Mrs. Tolley in the kitchen passage, in the way servants do when something has been sitting uneasily on their minds, said that she had got up once in the night, gone 2 in the morning by the landing clock, to see to a window banging in the wind, and had seen a light under the still-room door, and had thought nothing of it at the time, beyond hoping whoever it was would not be wanting cocoa made, since she was half asleep on her feet already. Asked gently by Mrs. Tolley whether she had seen who it was, Daisy said she had not stopped to look, being far too cold and far too sleepy to care, and had gone straight back to bed. It was a small thing, told to a housekeeper rather than a policeman, and it went no further that morning than the kitchen passage. But Miss Marple, who had taken to drinking her tea rather more often in that passage than strict good manners required, heard it within the hour, and added it, without comment, to the small private ledger she kept of such things. After breakfast, Dr. Webley took it upon himself, in the absence of any proper authority, to examine what could be examined without disturbing matters further, and came down some 20 minutes later, looking older than he had at breakfast, and asked Edith, quietly, whether the key to Walter's medicine cupboard was still where it had always been kept. "Connie has it," Edith said. "She has had it since Walter died. She has been so good about clearing things away." Dr. Webley said nothing further on the subject just then, but Miss Marple, who had taken to sitting in the morning room with her knitting, where she could see a good deal of the comings and goings in the hall, observed that he went looking for Connie almost at once, and that the conversation they had, in the passage outside the gun-room, was a short one, and that Connie came away from it with 2 spots of high colour in cheeks that had been quite pale all morning. Chapter 7. The afternoon. The snow did not let up. By 2 o'clock it had buried the lower terrace steps entirely, and was working steadily up the drive, and Albert, returning from a hopeless reconnaissance as far as the lodge gates, reported that a man could not get through on foot, let alone a car, and that he had heard from nobody, not even the postman, who generally managed the lane in worse weather than this. Miss Marple spent a good part of the afternoon, as she generally did in a strange house, in the kitchen passage, on the perfectly sound excuse of asking Mrs. Tolley's advice about a stitch pattern she had got wrong, and came away 3/4 of an hour later, knowing rather more about Ashworth Hall than anyone in the drawing-room would have guessed an old lady with knitting needles could learn in an afternoon. She knew that Walter Pembridge had been a hard man to please and a harder one to nurse, and that his heart medicine, the little white digitalis tablets the village doctor in Cranbourne Magna had prescribed 3 years before, had been kept in the still-room cupboard, and that Connie had taken sole charge of counting and giving them out for the last 8 months, since old Walter had grown too forgetful or too stubborn to be trusted with the bottle himself. She knew that Dr. Webley had signed the certificate for Walter's death without any great fuss, a man of 74 with a known heart complaint found dead in his bed of a morning being, in the ordinary way of country practice, nothing to call for more than a sad shake of the head and a quiet word of sympathy for the widow. And she knew, because Mrs. Tolley told her with the particular relish of a woman who has disliked someone for years and finally has an audience for it, that Gerald Pembridge owed money to men in London who did not send polite letters about it, and that there had been a fearful row between Gerald and his father not 3 weeks before Walter died, the sort of row the whole house had heard through closed doors, about a will that Walter meant, Mrs. Tolley was quite certain, to change. She learned, besides, a smaller and less obviously useful fact, that Dr. Webley had been calling at the Hall rather more often than his patient's heart strictly required in the last year of Walter's life, and that there had been talk in the village, the kind of talk that means nothing and everything depending on who repeats it, about how very fond the doctor had always been of Edith, long before either of them had married anyone else, and how a man might perhaps be slower than he ought to question a death that suited him rather well, without ever once intending anything so deliberate as a lie. "Change it how?" Miss Marple asked, very mildly, counting stitches. "That I couldn't say, madam, but Mr. Walter went up to town not a fortnight before he died to see his solicitor, and came back saying nothing to nobody, only looking very pleased with himself, the way he did when he'd got the better of someone. And then young Mr. Hale started coming round so often, didn't he, after years of never showing his face? I'm not one to put two and two together where it's not my place, madam, but I know what I saw." It was, Miss Marple reflected, walking back up to dress for tea, a very great deal of two and two to add up at once, and she did not, even now, care to say with confidence what total it came to. But she found her mind returning, as she dressed, not to Gerald's debts, which were common knowledge, and rather too conveniently dramatic to be the whole of the matter, nor to Dr. Webley's evident unease, which might mean guilt, or might mean only a doctor's natural alarm at having signed a certificate he was no longer quite sure of, but to a small brown bottle on a still-room shelf, and to a daughter who had taken sole charge of counting out her father's heart tablets for 8 months, and who had stood at his grave the day before without a single tear, and had stood this morning in a corridor over a second body with exactly the same still, careful face. It reminded her, in a way she could not yet put into words even to herself, of something that had happened years before in St. Mary Mead, concerning a chemist's assistant and an aunt's medicine, and a sum of money that had been due to come to somebody on a particular date. She could not, sitting at her dressing table that Saturday afternoon, with the snow still falling outside, quite recall how that business had ended, but she thought she would, given time, and she thought, too, that time was rather what this house had a great deal of just now, snowed in as it was, and nowhere for anybody to go. Chapter 8. Saturday night. Dinner that second night was a thin, unhappy affair, eaten mostly in silence, with Rupert's chair removed from the table by Albert's own quiet decision rather than anyone's instruction, because no one had been able to say out loud that it ought to be done, and somebody had to do it. Faith went up early with a headache that was, Miss Marple privately thought, very probably real, grief and fear together being quite enough to give anybody a headache in a house like this one. Gerald drank rather more than he ate, and said almost nothing. Edith retired soon after, leaning on Connie's arm, looking, for the first time since Miss Marple had arrived, genuinely old. It was a little after 11, with most of the house dark, and Miss Marple herself sitting up later than usual by her bedroom fire because sleep would not come, and a book seemed a better use of the time than lying awake listening to the snow, that she heard the sound from along the passage. Not loud, a soft bump, and then the unmistakable creak of the floorboard outside the end room, the one that had been Rupert's and was now locked. The key with Dr. Webley, who had taken charge of it that morning on the reasonable grounds that somebody official would want to see it exactly as it stood. Miss Marple did not, as a rule, go looking for trouble in a strange house at 11:30 at night. But she put on her dressing gown and opened her own door a careful few inches, and was in time to see, by the thin light of the single bulb left burning at the end of the corridor, a figure move quickly away from Rupert's door and round the turn toward the back stairs, too quickly and too quietly for an honest errand. It was Mrs. Tolley who raised the real alarm, not 5 minutes later, coming up with a candle to check, as she did every night, that the passage windows were properly latched against the cold, and finding Rupert's door standing open an inch, the lock forced rather clumsily, with something not much subtler than a kitchen knife, and the small writing desk inside disturbed, drawers not quite shut, papers not quite where Dr. Webley, who had glanced through them that morning out of a doctor's professional thoroughness and a friend's natural curiosity, was certain he had left them. The house came awake properly then, lamps lit along the passage. Edith roused a second time in 2 days, Gerald demanding to know who on earth would do such a thing. Connie standing very white in her dressing gown at the top of the stairs and saying, when at last somebody asked her directly, that she had been asleep the whole time and had heard nothing at all. There was a notebook, Dr. Webley said, going through the desk, with Albert holding the lamp for him. A small black one. I saw it this morning when I looked through his things. I am quite certain of it, and I am quite certain it is not here now. What was in it? Gerald asked. I don't know, Dr. Webley said, which might have been true and might not. And Miss Marple, standing a little apart in the doorway with her dressing gown buttoned to the throat, exactly as she had stood that morning, thought that a great many people in that corridor were saying things that might or might not be true, and that somewhere among them was one person who knew precisely what had been in that notebook, because they had gone to a good deal of trouble in the middle of a snowbound night to make quite certain nobody else ever would. Chapter 9. Sunday morning. Sunday came in white and silent. The snow stopped at last some time before dawn, leaving a sky scrubbed almost clean, and a stillness over the park that Miss Marple, looking out at it from her window with her tea going cold on the sill, found rather beautiful and entirely at odds with everything that had happened under that roof in the last 2 days. The household gathered for a breakfast that nobody pretended to enjoy, and afterward, by some unspoken agreement, scattered rather than sat together, Gerald to pace the gun-room, Faith to her prayer book in the small sitting-room, Edith to sit with her sister Lavinia, and a great many letters that wanted answering and could not yet be sent. Dr. Webley spent the better part of the morning by the telephone, lifting the receiver every 20 minutes or so on the chance that the line had mended itself overnight, and being disappointed each time. Miss Marple walked in the garden, where the paths had been roughly cleared by a footman with a shovel, and the snow stood in clean banks against the box hedges, and found Connie there before her, standing quite still by the frozen lily pond at the end of the lower walk, looking down into it as though something in the ice might answer a question for her. It is a hard thing, Miss Marple said, coming up beside her, to lose a father and then, within a fortnight, a guest under one's own roof. People will say all manner of unkind things before this is over, my dear, and very few of them fair. People always do, Connie said. She did not look round. They were saying things about father before he was even cold, about the will, about Rupert, as though grief weren't enough to be getting on with. Your father changed his will, I understand, not long before he died. He talked about changing it. For the first time, something sharper came into Connie's voice. Talking and doing were never quite the same thing with father. He liked to dangle a thing over people. He liked to watch them squirm. She stopped, as though she had said more than she meant to, and looked, finally, at Miss Marple directly. You knew my mother at school, she tells me. I don't suppose she ever told you what he was like to live with. She did not need to, Miss Marple said gently. I have met a great many Walters in my time, my dear, in villages a good deal smaller than this one. They are none of them very different from each other, underneath. He used to time us, Connie said suddenly, looking back at the ice. At meals, with his watch on the table beside his plate, and if we were not down to the dining room within 5 minutes of the gong, he would say nothing at all, only look at the watch, and then at us, and somehow that was a great deal worse than shouting would have been. Gerald learned to be late on purpose, just to provoke him, and then learned to drink instead, when provoking him stopped being amusing. I learned to be early. I have spent my whole life being early for things, Miss Marple. Early to breakfast, early to his bedside with his tablets, early to every small duty he ever set me. And do you know, I do not think he thanked me once. Not once, in 38 years. That is a very long time to go without thanks, Miss Marple said, for anything. It was, oddly, this small kindness, offered without any visible attempt to extract anything by it, that seemed to loosen something in Connie that a more direct question would only have closed tighter. She talked for some minutes by the frozen pond, about her father, about the years of small cruelties dressed up as wit, about a mother who had borne it because her generation had been taught to bear such things, about a brother who had escaped into debt and drink because it was easier than staying to manage a man like Walter Pembridge, and about herself, who had stayed and managed and counted out the old man's pills twice a day for 8 months because nobody else in that house could be trusted to do it properly. She did not, in all of this, say one word that a court of law could have used against her. But Miss Marple, walking back up to the house alone a little later, found that she had, almost without noticing, finally remembered the story she had been groping after since yesterday afternoon. The one about the chemist's assistant in St. Mary Mead. A woman called Mrs. Trefusis, who had nursed a difficult old aunt for years, and had, in the end, been caught out over nothing more dramatic than an inheritance and a single miscounted bottle of pills, because the assistant at the dispensary had happened to remember exactly how many tablets she had made up the month before, and the sum did not come right. It was, Miss Marple thought, climbing the terrace steps with the cold air sharp in her throat, a very great deal easier to get away with poisoning someone slowly, over months, with their own proper medicine in their own proper dose, a little heavier each time than the doctor had ordered, than it was to explain afterward, to a sharp-eyed nephew who had somehow worked it out and found the whole business privately, bitterly funny, why the bottle that should have held 30 tablets on a Tuesday morning held rather fewer than it ought. Chapter 10. The Thor. The Thor, when it came suddenly, as it often does after a hard snow, a warm wind off the sea overnight that had the drive running with water by Sunday afternoon, and the lane, by 4 o'clock, passable enough for a determined man on a bicycle, who turned out to be the postman, 3 days late and considerably out of temper about it, with a bundle of letters and the news that he had passed 2 policemen on foot not half a mile back, making slow work of the last drift by the bridge. It was Inspector Curl who arrived a little after 5, a brisk, fair-haired man not yet 40, with the particular impatience of an officer who has walked the last mile of his journey through melting snow and does not intend to waste any further time being delicate with grieving families. He took one look at the locked room, heard Dr. Webley's account of the body and the missing notebook in considerably less time than Dr. Webley wanted to give it, and announced, within the hour, that he saw very little mystery in any of it. A young man with a weak head for whiskey, mixed with whatever he had been taking for his nerves, and a burglary by some local opportunist who had heard, as such people always seem to hear, that there was a house full of mourners, too occupied with their own grief to mind the silver. "There is the matter of the notebook," Dr. Webley said. "There's the matter of a great many things in a house this size, Doctor, and most of them will turn out to mean nothing at all." Inspector Curl had already half decided, in the way of a tired man eager to be home before his own supper went cold, that the simplest explanation was the likeliest one, and it took Dr. Webley a further quarter of an hour and the considerable weight of his own medical reputation in the district to persuade him that the body at least ought to be properly examined before anyone signed anything final. It was at this point, with the inspector standing in the hall, pulling on gloves he had only just removed, and plainly anxious to be gone, that Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly in the morning room throughout the whole brisk, dismissive business, came out into the hall with her knitting still in her hands, and asked, in the mild, apologetic voice of an old lady who feels she ought not to trouble busy men, but cannot quite help herself, whether the inspector had had occasion, in his work, to come across many cases of digitalis poisoning. Inspector Curl, who had not expected to be addressed at all by the small grey-haired woman he had taken, on entering, for some sort of poor relation kept on out of charity, looked at her with the particular blankness of a man deciding whether he is being made fun of. "Digitalis, madam, heart medicine," Miss Marple said. "It is a very useful thing, properly given, and a very dangerous thing, given carelessly, or given on purpose by somebody who understands the dose a great deal better than the patient does. It has a most interesting property, Inspector, given in slightly too large an amount, Over and over, it can stop a tired old heart in a way that looks, to anyone not looking very closely, exactly like the heart simply giving out of its own accord, and given in a single large amount to a strong young heart that has no business stopping at all. It can do the same thing rather faster, and looks, to anyone not looking very closely, exactly like a young man who drank too much the night before. The hall had gone very quiet. Gerald, coming down the stairs at that moment with his coat half on, stopped where he stood. Connie, who had come out from the drawing room at the sound of voices, stood very still by the door. "I think," Miss Marple said, into that silence, looking not at the inspector now, but very gently at Connie, that if anyone were to count the tablets remaining in old Mr. Pembridge's medicine bottle against the date the chemist in Cranbourne Magna last made it up, the sum would not come right at all. And I think that is very probably what poor Mr. Hale found out, going through his uncle's desk, those long evenings everyone thought were so companionable, and I think it amused him a great deal more than it ought to have, because he never did have the sense to be frightened of the right things at the right time. Chapter 11. The Trap. Connie Pembridge did not faint, or cry out, or do any of the things a less careful woman might have done in that hall, with the inspector watching her, and her own brother frozen halfway down the stairs. She stood very straight in the way she had stood at her father's grave, and said, in a voice that had gone perfectly flat, "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, my dear," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "I think you have known, every hour of every day for 8 months, exactly how many tablets ought to be in that bottle, and exactly how many were. It is a small thing to remember, on its own. A great many devoted daughters could tell you, to the tablet, how much medicine they have given a difficult parent over a long illness. It is only a terrible thing when one remembers it, because one has been making the sum come out wrong on purpose, week after week, a little at a time, so that nobody, least of all a tired old doctor signing a certificate for a man with a known weak heart, would ever think to look twice. "You can't prove any of this," Connie said. "You're an old woman telling stories about a village chemist." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I cannot prove it. But I think Inspector Curl's people, when they open that medicine bottle and send it to be properly analysed, and when they speak to the dispensary at Cranbourne Magna about exactly how much was made up and exactly when, will find that I have not told a story at all, only a sum, and sums, my dear, are dreadfully hard things to argue with." She paused. "And I think Mr. Hale found that out for himself, going through his uncle's papers, perhaps a note Mr. Pembridge had made about the dosage, perhaps something a less devoted daughter would have been more careful to destroy, and I think he found it, God forgive him, very funny indeed, that a family so given to playing at grief should have one member playing at something rather worse, and I think that is exactly what he was laughing about at the graveside, because he could not yet quite believe his own good fortune in having found it. He meant to use it, of course. Men like Mr. Hale generally do. It was Gerald who broke, in the end, rather than Connie, coming the rest of the way down the stairs with his face working, and saying, in a voice none of them had heard from him in years, "He told me. Saturday night, before dinner, he told me he knew something that would turn this whole house upside down, and he laughed about it, and I told him to go to the devil. I never once thought, I never dreamed it could be Connie, my own sister. I thought he meant the debts. I thought he meant me, of all people." "You always did think everything was about you, Gerald," Connie said, and there was something almost gentle in the contempt of it, the tiredness of an old, settled argument, rather than a new one. "Be quiet, Gerald," Connie said, and for the first time her flat composure cracked clean through, not into tears, but into something harder and far more frightening, a kind of cold, exhausted fury that had plainly been held in check for a very long time and had nowhere left to go. "You'd have let him ruin us both rather than lift a finger. You always did let other people manage the unpleasant things. Father knew it. That's why he meant to leave it all to that smiling, useless boy, instead of to either of us, because at least Rupert amused him. and neither of us ever had the wit to amuse him, only the duty to nurse him, year after year, while he told everyone in 3 counties what disappointments his children were. She stopped herself, but it was a moment too late, and Inspector Curl, who had stopped looking like a man anxious to be home for his supper some minutes before, stepped forward at last and said the things that have to be said in such moments, about cautions and stations and solicitors, in a voice that had recovered, gratefully, all its proper official weight. Miss Marple did not stay to watch the rest of it. She went back into the morning room, picked up her knitting from the chair where she had left it, and sat down by the fire, feeling, as she generally did at the end of such business, not triumphant at all, but rather tired, and rather sad, for a clever, unhappy woman who might, in some other house, with some other father, have made a perfectly good life for herself, and had not been given the chance to find out. Chapter 12. Monday morning. The lane was properly open by Monday, churned to brown slush by the police cars and the doctor's car, and, eventually, the van that came for Connie. And by 10 o'clock, Inspector Curl stood in the hall, accepting Edith's stiff, exhausted thanks, with the particular satisfaction of a man who intends, in his report, to make rather more of his own contribution to the morning's events than a strictly honest account would support. And nobody in that hall, least of all Miss Marple, saw any reason to correct him. "A nasty business, properly seen to in the end," the inspector said, shaking Dr. Webley's hand. "These things generally are simpler than they look, once you know where to apply a bit of proper method." "Quite," said Dr. Webley, who had a great many opinions about the morning's proper method, and the good sense to keep them to himself. Edith saw Miss Marple off at the door an hour later, the two of them standing a moment on the steps in the thin, washed sunlight, while Albert saw to the cases. "I don't know how to thank you, Jane." "There is nothing to thank me for, my dear. I only noticed a thing or two that anyone might have noticed, given time to sit still and knit and watch." Miss Marple drew her gloves on. "I am sorry it was Connie. I think, in some other life, she might have been a friend of mine. We are not so very different, women who spend their lives noticing what other people would rather not have noticed." Edith had no answer to that, and did not, perhaps, entirely understand it, and Miss Marple did not press the point. She got into the car that was to take her to the station and looked back once at Ashworth Hall, its black crape already coming down from the looking-glasses on Mrs. Tolley's brisk instruction. The clocks, she did not doubt, already started again. Daisy, polishing the brass at the foot of the steps, looked up as the car went past and bobbed a small, uncertain curtsy, not quite sure, even now, what the quiet old lady with the knitting bag had actually done, only that the house felt different with her gone from it. Lighter in some way, nobody troubled to explain to a 15-year-old housemaid, who had, in any case, already been promised a very good character by Mrs. Tolley and a place found for her, through the housekeeper's own sister, in a smaller and considerably happier house some miles away. The train was on time, for once. Miss Marple took her seat by the window, opened her knitting, and watched the bare, wet Kentish fields go by, thinking, not for the first time, that the trouble with families was that they were so very like villages, only smaller, and shut up together a great deal more closely, with nowhere at all to go when the weather turned against them.